and a world which had hitherto thought in terms of horse and steam power, broke the news of the discovery in far-off places of a dark, chemically neutral substance, crude oil.
The story of fossil fuel is like Pandora's box. This gift of fire that released the age of industry would also release a curse.
The tragedy is, this is not a movie, and the doomsday device is real.
For more than 200 years, people powered factories and machines with fossil fuels that release greenhouse gases as they burn, and they slashed into forests that absorb those gases. We call them greenhouse gases because they form a blanket around our atmosphere. That traps in more and more of the sun's heat, and that cooks up more intense storms.
Look at what's happening in our country now with these tornadoes, these hurricanes, these rains, these flash floods, the wildfires we're seeing. It is simply unprecedented.
If we cross the red line on this, scientists say we'll have mass crop failures, much of the world will flood, and will suffer through an unending chain of disasters that will be far more intense.
Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We are digging our own graves.
This is the red line. Scientists say we must keep the Earth's temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius since the industrial age began, and it's already risen 1.1.
Monsieur le Président de la République.
Which brings us to one of the most complicated negotiations in world history. It all came together in 2015 in the city of Paris.
Well, the Paris Agreement was incredibly important. It was the first time that the world got together and said every country has to participate in addressing the challenge of climate change, both the developed world and the developing world.
In 2015, nearly every nation on Earth committed to reducing carbon emissions. It was a breakthrough in diplomacy that started long before the celebrations in Paris. The US and China were key players, and Todd Stern was the chief negotiator for the United States.
What techniques did you use to bring around countries that were a tough sell?
First of all, you try to understand what the other country needs. You try to figure out whether they can get what they need while still giving you more of what you need. And so you try to really hear what the other one's saying, not just lecture them. You know, it's also important to form coalitions and to have not just you, but as many allies as you can get.
Stern's first attempt did not go as he had hoped. In 1997, he was President Bill Clinton's senior negotiator for a deal known as the Kyoto Protocol.
The agreement is environmentally strong and economically sound.
It legally bound wealthier, developed nations to reduce their carbon emissions, and it encouraged, but did not bind, developing nations like China to do the same. Kyoto failed because it depended on the United States to succeed.
Because we're so big and powerful as a country that you need to have the United States in a climate regime.
But because the agreement has legally binding emission targets, it required approval from the United States Senate, and that sealed its fate.
Thank you.
Already says the Senate will not approve it.
A division, something that says US has to do X and China doesn't have to do X is just the end of the game in the US. And you need 2/3 of the Senate. So you have to get 67 votes. There was no chance for us to get 67 votes for that kind of agreement.
That failure taught Stern and his fellow diplomats a valuable lesson in diplomacy and politics.
And I saw the United States say yes in Kyoto and come home and not be able to join because the Senate wouldn't approve it.
12 years later, in 2009, President Obama named Stern U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change.
I interact a great deal with my Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping.
And by 2011, he and the climate minister of China were developing the ground rules for the breakthrough in Paris.
Many meetings. I mean, when I left the State Department, it turned out they keep a printout of the trips you take. And I didn't even know this, but I took 135 trips, in different parts of the world.
How many hours did it take to put this all together?
It was literally negotiated over a 4-year period. So it's thousands of hours, if you think about it, that went into Paris.
And many drafts in which one word can make a big difference. For example, the word should means you ought to do something. Shall means you have to do something. And when they wrote the wrong term into the text, it delayed the process which had already been through years of arguments.
Most countries in the world wanted the targets countries took to be legally binding. And from our point of view, we didn't think that could work. There were, in general, lots of arguments that involved developing countries, including some of the biggest ones, not wanting to have to do the same things that developed countries did, to say, you guys do that and we'll do something less.
By this point, developing countries as a group were emitting more carbon pollution than developed countries. And the arguments over double standards and binding targets all reminded Stern of the failure at Kyoto.
When President Obama and Hillary Clinton asked me to take this job, one thing I knew was I didn't want to make that mistake again.
But as the arguments dragged on, the diplomats from New Zealand had what we call a light bulb moment. Why not let each country decide how much pollution to reduce based on what they think is best? And why not make those pledges non-binding for everybody?
It wasn't like we ever talked to them about it or asked them to do this or anything like that, but I think New Zealand was trying to figure out what kind of agreement could the United States join and China join and everybody else join, even if it's not perfect. How can we do something that could work?
To this day, critics say making targets unenforceable produced a weak deal with no teeth.
You don't even have to mention greenhouse gases in your commitment if you don't want to. You send in any piece of paper you want, we're going to staple them all together, and we're going to call that the Paris Accord. And so you can staple those together and you can say we now have a global agreement, but what you have is an agreement to do nothing.
But as the diplomats talked it through, they discovered a weaker deal in terms of enforcement would produce a stronger deal in terms of results. First, with no binding targets, the US could join without a Senate approval. And they found countries around the world would more likely set higher goals if they got to set their own targets. And they didn't have to worry about being punished if they missed them.
I mean, it was a closed meeting. There was no cameras, there was no press, it was private. But a number of the big developing countries said that they would take weaker targets for precisely that reason, that they would be worried about the consequences if they took a target that was legally binding and they failed to meet it.
And while they agreed to make the pledges non-binding, they required countries to commit to progress reports to reveal whether they met their goals or by how much they missed. The diplomats figured global peer pressure would motivate countries, maybe even more so than legal requirements, because they want to maintain their reputation in trade partners. Combine that with pledges to help developing nations brace for rising sea levels and fund the transition to clean energy, the key holdouts like India came along.
They would not walk away if other big players were saying yes. So we struck a pretty good deal there in the end.
But not perfect, because the pledges still weren't enough to hold off that 2-degree rise in temperature that scientists warned us about. And as more data came to light, they've since lowered that red line to 1.5 degrees. And that's why the diplomats included a requirement that countries reevaluate their goals every 5 years.
And even if countries are not forced to put in new targets, because technically they're in the middle of an existing target, there's a lot of pressure on them to do more. And I think that pressure to do more is exactly what we wanted.
But the next president, Donald Trump, said the US had done too much.
Disadvantages the United States.
He claimed the US set goals that were disproportionately high,
while imposing no meaningful obligations on the world's leading polluters.
But while he tried to withdraw the US,
so we're getting out.
The diplomats added language stating you could not formally withdraw for 4 years, which wound up saving the agreement in the United States.
We're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord as of today.
Hey, hey, ho, ho, fossil fuels have got to go, hey, hey.
Which is where Todd Stern says we all have a voice in what happens next.
There's a tremendous capacity for young people in high schools and colleges and stuff to have impact.
In an age of absolutes in the world of politics, the diplomats crafted a masterpiece in nuance and contradiction, which is often the mark of true diplomacy. With the Paris Agreement, they made it weaker in order to make it stronger. It was both a quantum leap and a small first step. It was the greatest progress in fighting climate change the world has ever known, and yet it's still not enough.
The trend is in our direction, it just needs to speed up.
And as the story of fossil fuels compares to the curse of Pandora's box, this moment in Paris reflects the rest of the tale, the moment when Pandora found hope.